Okay, this is the 25th of October 2012. I'm Tony Curzon Price, and this is another Open Democracy podcast. I'm very pleased to be here with here at the British Library. If you hear some background noise, it's because we're in the really wonderful surroundings of the cafe at the British Library, somewhere which anyone in London I highly recommend a visit to. I'm very pleased to be here with Keith Kahn-Harris. Keith is someone whom Open Democracy readers will know well. You should go to his page on Open Democracy, and you'll see a really stunning array of articles over the years. You may remember the article that was very made a lot of noise on Open Democracy. Made a lot of signal on Open Democracy. Was one on the politics of the Middle East, combined with a story about internet forums and ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and really an article which had 50,000 reads, one of our very high read articles on Open Democracy, and sparked off in a moment of irony quite a comment thread. It was an article about the way in which comment threads got out of control and created more noise than signal. Anyway, do go and have a look at these articles, and also go and have a look at Kahn-Harris.org, which has got a lot of information about what Keith's various projects. One of the striking things, doing a little bit of reading around what Keith does, is firstly, if you look at what he wrote about chronic fatigue, one of the interesting things is, he talks about the way in which chronic fatigue affects a life. He also he makes the point, well, actually, it's not entirely clear that the normal life that one's invited to lead is a particularly good one. And actually, looking at Keith's remarkable prolific cultural output, I have to say that it's a sort of advertisement for taking a step out from the busy life which many of us think we lead, and actually concentrating on producing useful stuff. So there's a remarkable amount of stuff on the website about what Keith is doing. Anyway, this particular conversation is about Keith's last book. He's working on a couple of others, but the last book, which is simply called Judaism, All That Matters. And it's a short book, but it's a hugely condensed book about Judaism. I suppose my feeling on reading it was that in some ways it felt like being it was a tour guide around a neighborhood, and it was for someone who was pretty busy and going through that neighborhood, with only an afternoon to spare, as it were. So, but nevertheless, an extremely expert tour through it. The striking thing is that in its 120 pages, I think that what Keith does is he establishes a lot of starting points about what an identity is, and particularly what a political identity is. Keith, is that a fair description of what you're doing, and could you say a little bit about who the book is for?
First of all, thanks a lot for having me on the podcast, Tony, and for saying such nice things about me. Yes, in terms of the book, I think you're probably right. The concept that maybe ties it all together, or the concept that's behind the scenes, if you like, is one of identity, which is essentially, who is a Jew? Who are Jews? Who do Jews see themselves as? What do Jews aspire to be, Jewishly? And that ties together really quite a huge range of identities that Jews have assumed over the years. Jews are by no means a monolithic people. If any people are, in fact, monolithic, Jews certainly are not. But what I think ties all the different kinds of identities together, religious, secular, political, national, whatever, is this sort of constant struggle to define oneself as Jewish, and what it means to define oneself as Jewish, against the backdrop of a world in which Jews have always only ever been a small minority. So to answer your question of what I was trying to do with the book, what I was trying to do with the book is to be a starting point for people who are asking the same question but from outside, who are asking, who are Jews? And I'm answering it not by saying this is what Jews are, but I'm saying this is the starting points from which to look, because ultimately there's no shortcuts, because the question of what Jews are and what Judaism is what the Jews don't have a cut and dried answer to, or if they do, it's usually a very bad answer.
So firstly, I'd like to say that there's an extremely good and rather compendious list of 100 sources, in fact, at the end of the book that certainly point anyone who's interested in the longer and deeper and more complex story towards it. So it is a brief introduction to a neighbourhood, but it certainly points you in all the directions I think that one would want to go in. What you just said makes me think of a few things. One of the things I was struck with in the book, and you make reference to it several times, is in a sense the many layers of identity that have coalesced around Jewishness. So there are ethnic conceptions of identity, there are religious conceptions of identity, there are national conceptions of identity, there's a nation there's a culture, there's a tradition, and finally there's a state in the state of Israel. There's something quite interesting about having quite so many ways of identifying oneself and telling a story about oneself, coalescing around a single purported identity, or certainly a single handle for it.
I think one of the reasons why, as a Jew, I love Judaism, or one of the reasons why, more specifically as a writer and an academic and an intellectual, I love Judaism, is that it really subverts a lot of the categories through which we think in the contemporary Western world. The concepts of religion, nation, culture, ethnicity, whatever, are often treated as though they're quite clear, as though they're transhistorical, as though they're transcultural, but they're actually not. They don't really define what Jews and Judaism is very well, because most Jews, their identity is made up of a hodgepodge of elements that could be seen as religious, national, ethnic, cultural, whatever. And there are, of course, some Jews who define themselves more narrowly in terms of one of those concepts, but I think historically it's been very, very difficult to make those kinds of distinctions. And I think what that tells you is the concept of how recent and how culturally specific concepts such as culture, religion, ethnicity, and so on are. I mean, they're really post-Enlightenment concepts. They don't really. The very concept of religion implies a variety of religions, which was not the case 1,000 years ago in Europe, or at least it wasn't in most of Europe. And it also implies the possibility of having no religion, which was would have been a very bizarre concept a while ago, not just to Christians but to Jews as well. So there's a sense that the example of Judaism subverts some of these categories. Although in fairness, it's not just Judaism that does that. To a certain extent, Islam does it as well, and even Christianity to an extent too.
So one of the things you start off with, talking about the modernity of the concept, you start off with a number of the book reinforces, but the statement of big radical changes that happened in Judaism, and you talk of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. You talk of the 56, 70. I can't. Anyway,
it's in the book
somewhere around.
It's in the book. I forget the exact date.
Soon after the death of Christ.
A little later than that, but yes, go on.
You talk then about emancipation as being a second radical change, and these are the words you use: radical change. You don't talk about either the Holocaust or the birth of Israel as being similarly on that scale of radical changes. Is that because you subsume them in the after effects of emancipation?
That's a great question. I think first of all I need to answer that by explaining why those two particular points that I identify were so radical. The destruction of the Second Temple in the 1st century CE basically changed the entire character of Judaism, because before that, although there was a diaspora, even at that early stage, the Jewish religious rites were centered around the temple in Jerusalem. So it was very much a place-specific religion set around, there was a priestly caste who did rituals for Jews. I mean, even at that stage, there was the early development of what we now consider Jewish religion, but it was a very different kind of Jewish religion. And what the destruction of the temple meant, and the increasing dispersion of Jews from that area, although it had started even before the destruction of the Second Temple, what that meant was that Judaism had to become portable. It had to be able to be done in a wide variety of different kinds of places with very, very different kinds of contexts. And that meant a set of rituals, a set of prayers, a set of canonical text that could survive that process of diaspora. So that was the first sort of radical change. And the second radical change in the emancipation, which is broadly something that started really in the late 18th century and continued over the 19th century in most Western countries and also in some non-Western countries as well, was that Jews began to have the freedom to not be Jewish by being allowed to take their place as citizens rather than subjects, as full citizens in countries that were more or less democratic. They could subsume their identities into the greater whole, into the greater national identities. Now, of course, that was never as simple a process as some of the early advocates of emancipation might have liked. Anti-Semitism ensured that Jews often weren't allowed to forget their origins, even when they necessarily wanted to. But nonetheless, this choice to be Jewish or not Jewish led to what was really very much a crisis of Judaism. What should Judaism, now that there were no constraints on Judaism, now that Judaism was not essentially self-governing in ghettos that were hidden from the world, what should Judaism be? And a lot of the movements, Jewish movements that we see today, whether those are ultra-Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, Reform Judaism, secular Judaism, do date from that period.
So back to the question about why not the Holocaust in Israel. I want to go back to the very early stuff and the portability, but can I get an attempt at an answer? I know it's a big question, but so why not? The question was not why were those radical, but
Sure.
Why not the Holocaust in Israel as being, in a sense, on that scale?
Well, obviously, the Holocaust and the State of Israel were massive, catastrophic, cataclysmic.
No, not the State of Israel, presumably from your point of view.
Cataclysmic in its most literal sense, in the sense of being a sort of absolutely massive event. But I still think that, well, for example, the Holocaust obviously wiped out a huge section of the Jewish world, and a lot of things were gone forever. But it ended up that world that was lost ended up being reconstructed in the ultra-Orthodox community. And Judaism, the centre of gravity of Judaism, shifted to the English-speaking world, particularly to America, and also to the State of Israel. Although not initially the State of Israel, which took a while after 1948 to become as large a portion of the Jewish world as it is today. I think that it is quite possible that the State of Israel will take that place on the pantheon as the third most important event in Jewish history, or one of the top three most important events in Jewish history. But I think it's important to say that it didn't, it's hard to imagine this now, but in 1948 its impact was not quite as much as one might imagine in retrospect. It was, not all Jews were Zionists at that point, and the Jewish population of Israel was only a few 100,000. It's only really been in the post-67 period where Israel has become a superpower, and when in recent years the Jewish population of Israel has become either equal to or greater than, the numbers are disputed, the Jewish population of anywhere else in the world, that Israel has become so important. And it's certainly true that it has affected Jewish life everywhere around the world. But I think the jury is out at the moment about whether, if you're taking the longue durée, whether it's quite as important as the emancipation and the destruction of the Second Temple.
So your answer on Israel is too early to tell. Your answer on the Holocaust is it destroyed much is irreplaceable, but that what it destroys has been reconstructed. Is that really what you believe? It seems to me that so again I read your book after having read a rather older book, but a fascinating book by Anna Finkelkraut, the Imaginary Jew, in which he has a great nostalgia. That book is about saying, look, what was destroyed was Yiddish culture, and there were innumerable plural ways of being Jewish in pre-Holocaust Central Eastern Europe, which simply have been destroyed, where return to the plurality of Judaism is not possible.
Well, there's several ways of answering that. One is, I would say that clearly it was catastrophic. Clearly there is an enormous amount to mourn, and it is very difficult for us from this distance to even today to grasp the sheer magnitude of that disaster. But I think the first thing to say is that Judaism has become over the centuries become incredibly good at recovering from catastrophes. The Holocaust may be the worst catastrophe in the history of the Jewish people, but it wasn't the only one. The Spanish and Portuguese expulsion in 1492 was pretty enormous. So was, of course, the Babylonian exiles and the Syrian exile in antiquity. And one of the things that makes Judaism so extraordinary is it has this extraordinary resilience that does allow it to reconstruct itself, particularly because Hitler could never get to all the Jews. There were whole parts of the world particularly in the Middle East, that the Holocaust barely touched at all. And also the other reason I'd say is that yes, there are some things we can never get back. But we are reconstructing that plurality. If you look at the Jewish world in the last 10 and 20 years, there's been something of a renaissance in Jewish culture that is, in which people are actively trying to create a more diverse and more exciting, more vital Judaism. So it's a catastrophe, but it wasn't a fatal catastrophe.
So let's. But it seems like a good place to go back to a point that we left on these important avenues. I don't want to call them tangents, but a point that we left, which is the first of your two radical changes, the ancient history, as it were, and the portability. That great thing about the portability of the identity. That portability, as you just mentioned, actually predates the destruction of the Second Temple, doesn't it? In that you're. I mean, firstly, Moses creates a portable law. I mean, one of the remarkable things in religious terms is that the God is portable in tablets. It's portable in law. So we already have a God which, by the way, I like very much the way in which you refer to God as it in the book. A God that has already defined himself in text. Itself in text.
I mean, I think that there's a tension in early Judaism, if you like, and within the Bible and other Jewish texts between that the portability of Jewish law, which can be observed everywhere, the idea of God as omnipresent and omniscient and ineffable, together with all of that on one side, together with the idea of the temple on the other side. And the temple, if you like, it's much more where you go to make sacrifices to God. You bring your first fruits and all that kind of stuff, and where there is a priestly caste that does rituals on your behalf to intercede with God. So that's a tension within Judaism, which didn't entirely disappear with the destruction of the temple. If I can qualify what I was saying earlier, because there is within Judaism there's these universal and particularist strains. On the one hand, Judaism is very much about Jews. You know, in Judaism, unlike Christianity and Islam, there's nothing wrong with not being Jewish. It's fine to not be Jewish, provided you observe a few simple ethical laws. There's nothing wrong with not being Jewish. Not only that, but there's no particular desire to convert non-Jews to Judaism. The idea of the chosen people is not an idea that Jews are better than other people. It's just that Jews are set apart from other people, which I think is very important and is often forgotten. So that's the particular. Where's the universal? The universal is if you look in the biblical text and also in later texts like the Talmud, there is a huge amount of stuff about ethics. It's a highly ethical creed, and a lot of it is to do with how one deals with one fellow human being, not just one fellow Jews.
And where the distinction is law versus ethics. So obviously the law is particular in that it applies only to Jews, but the ethics applies generally to humanity, does it?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, it's a very complicated story, but yes. But also, there is a sense that Judaism is a messianic religion, although different Jews at different times have emphasized this more or less. It's a messianic religion in the sense that there is the hope that there will be a messianic age, and all of the world will benefit from the messianic age. It will not just be the Jews will get their just rewards.
But it's interesting. I mean, there's that famous passage there in Isaiah. It's a strange sort of messianism, at least for the messianism of the universalist religions. In that, I'm certainly no scholar here, but in Isaiah, for example, the thought is that there will be a victorious moment, an entry into Jerusalem, in which the Jews, in which the Gentiles finally recognise that the Jews were right, that Yahweh was
that's one strain. I mean, it's people play. I mean, there are a number of ways of reading Isaiah. And there are another number of ways of reading Messianism. Another way to read it was that all of humanity will benefit from what the Jews bring about. That would be another way. Now, it's. This goes right up to today. There are a lot of Jews, particularly on the sort of more progressive end of the spectrum, who emphasise the universalist prophetic tradition with Judaism. They often use a term called tikkun olam, which means the repair of the world, which is originally actually a Kabbalistic concept, the idea that the world is broken, that the sparks of goodness are broken and one needs to gather them up. And that's That's a classic example of how what was once a particularistic Kabbalistic concept becomes read in a universalistic way. Similarly, the prophetic Reform Judaism often talks about the prophetic tradition, so drawing on the prophets to talk about how it's the Jews, what Jews should do is to make the world a better place. But of course, there are other things within the prophet. You can read the prophets in both ways.
And actually, again, something you mentioned on the liturgical side that emphasizes the particular is that the liturgy asks for the rebuilding of the temple, or at least some liturgies do.
Yes, some versions of Reformed Judaism have excised those references. Some haven't. Some see that the Messianic age in a very metaphorical way, rather than talking about a literal Messiah.
Yes. On portability, of course, I think you quote that extraordinary passage from Tacitus, where Tacitus describes the shock horror that Pompey finds on the destruction, on entering the temple and finding that Holy of Holies contains nothing.
I don't think I quoted that actually, but it's a very...
But back to the portability, that you may have this temple, but actually the heart, as it were, has got nothing.
Yes, I mean...
A shock horror for the Roman conception of a god.
All that said, I mean, despite the fact that Judaism has thrived, in fact, Judaism has been a portable religion much longer than it ever was a temple-based religion. But we're still commanded to mourn it. There's a festival called Tisha B'Av where you mourn the destruction of the Temple of Israel by fasting. Now, some non-Orthodox Jews have issues about that, saying, well, actually, there's nothing very much to mourn. But again, you could carry that in a metaphorical way, if you like, as a kind of a loss of innocence, as a loss of sovereignty, which the modern state of Israel, some would say it brings that sovereignty back. Others would say, no, it's gone and it's gone forever. And in a way, I think often peoples and religions need actually that origin myth of an original catastrophe. In a way, it's that original catastrophe that defines you.
Your final chapter, which is about where things are now, where things are going for a Jewish people, Jewish identity. You quote, I think, someone characterising the Jews as the ever-dying people.
Sarah Rabidovitz.
Right, okay. I mean, that's a very striking... actually, so you end your book, begin the ending of your book on the ever-dying people, and you start the book on as you're describing the religious texts, of saying, well, actually, these religious texts describe how tribes become a people. And it seems to me that there's a link there between the two, that a conception of ever dying is, as you've just said, a way of maintaining yourself. It's only the fear that you're about to disappear that will the fear of catastrophe.
I wouldn't say it's only the fear, but I would say that it is that sense that Jews throughout the generations have felt that they could be the last ones is very old. Although the reasons for it have shifted in recent years. A lot of the fear that today's Jews will be the only ones is due to fears about assimilation, a sense that the modern world is too good to the Jews rather than it's too hostile to the Jews. But that fear can be a productive fear. It can be a productive fear is that it provides an impetus to remain strong, to remain coherent, to remain committed. The problem is that when that fear starts eating you up inside and it becomes too inward-looking, and that can happen, it has happened in Jewish histories, and I think that there is a happy medium there. There's a happy medium in the sense of too lachrymose a view of Jewish history is quite harmful. But of course we have to recognise the fact that there have been an enormous amount of catastrophes in Jewish history, and there's been an enormous amount of suffering.
I'm very lots of thoughts coming out of this. One of them is remembering a description that Paul Venn, the historian, has of the Jewish people, whom he calls the party of Yahweh. And what he points out is that historically, of course, it has to be the case that there have constantly been people who've been born and grown up in a Jewish culture who've abandoned that Jewish culture. Historically, the numbers mean that must be a historical norm, and that therefore those who haven't, who've maintained that identity through time, are precisely the ones who are constantly aware that actually you could fall away.
I mean, the question of the continuity of the Jewish people is a hugely contested one. The question of how far today's Jews date their origins back, can trace their origins directly back to the temple, to the first temple or whatever. And in the book I kind of sit on the fence because it's just too complicated. There is genetic evidence to suggest that there is at the very least, a reasonable degree of coherence amongst the Jewish people that links up Jews in very different parts of the world from each other. So Yemeni Jews and Jews in Britain will share some things, or at least a significant proportion will. On the other hand, there are also equally compelling bits of historical evidence that suggest that at earlier points, particularly in the first millennium, Judaism was a proselytizing religion. So that Judaism hasn't always been as close to proselytes as it became perhaps in the second millennium. But again, that is, so there's a lot of debate over the Khazars, which were Central Asian people who may or may not have, their leadership converted to Judaism, but the question is whether or not their followers converted to Judaism and how strong this was or whatever.
In that very weird book by
Arthur Koestler, and all of which is often used in very cynical ways as ways of doing down Judaism and particularly criticising Zionism. But it is certainly I'm not sure it's true that the ones who got to the 20th century were necessarily the descendants of the most committed remnants, because there were plenty of committed Jews who simply got killed or were forced to convert in the Crusades or in the Spanish expulsion and stuff like that. A lot of it has to do with luck about where you actually lived.
Yes, although what's certain is that if you weren't committed, then I mean, it seems to me that we have this. In a sense, we're used to thinking about identity the modern nation and the modern nation state coming out of Christian roots has made us think about the kind of indissociable aspects of these identities which are split apart. So that the state and the nation and the territory and the religion and inevitably in pre-modern times the ethne, the background, the language, all these things stick on top of each other, are separable, and in a sense in the Jewish case that the Jewish case is the demonstration of the separability of these identities, of these bits and pieces.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the separability is as much as anything else a modern phenomenon. If you look at Jews essentially for most of their history lived in what were essentially self-governing communities that had a more or less, depending on the time and place, a more or less positive relationship with the ruling majority. Within those self-governing communities, there could be an enormous amount of control about what Jews could and did do. Jews can and did leave, but that leaving is very much like was very much like what it is to leave a cult today. If you left those Jewish communities, you could never go back. Conversion was a pretty nuclear option. So, in a sense, as much as that Jews voluntaristically maintained their Jewishness to a certain extent, and this is why the emancipation was such a catastrophe, they were forced to maintain it.
I'm going to come on to emancipation, but I just want to finish this little strand that we're on. Again, huge and complicated strand, but we're talking about fear and the role of being the fear of being the last, the ever dying people. There's something special. There's something potentially worrying when, and maybe this happens to every nation state, when that conception of the fear for one's identity gets married to power, to might, because one can easily see, and this applies, it seems to me, to quite possibly to every strong identity that acquires the means of a state. One can see how you get to rather overreactive.
Well, that's the challenge of Zionism, and at some points in the short history of the State of Israel, it has dealt with that challenge in rational and fairly calm ways, and sometimes it's dealt with it in near hysterical ways. And yes, I agree. The marriage of peoplehood with power is something that is hugely fraught with challenges. In fairness, many Zionist thinkers are completely open about that today, about how that is a challenge and a responsibility. There's certainly a very strong, not just liberal Zionists, who would say that this is our responsibility, is to get it right, to use power in an appropriate way. Some people, of course, would say that they haven't. Israel hasn't often used power in an appropriate way. But it's certainly true that there are sections of Israel and Zionists and of the Jewish people generally who have created quite a dangerous combination of having great power with a conception of being powerless. If you look at, that's the way that certainly Benjamin Netanyahu, and particularly his father, was a great influence on him, see it, is that they see that we have a responsibility for the survival of the Jewish people. We are weak. The support of Gentiles can never be assured, even of the United States, and therefore we have a duty to react first to not just to current threats but for potential threats as well. Now, I would say certainly I don't hold with Netanyahu's understanding of Jewish history, but I don't think it's completely invalid in the sense that that ultimately one of the strongest arguments for Zionism is that without a state, Jews will always be stateless people are always vulnerable, and that now whether the building of a state is necessarily the best answer to that is a hotly debated question.
Yes. Well, you mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, you mentioned Isaac Deutscher, both of whom are very strongly thought that actually that was the wrong.
Sure.
The wrong solution. Certainly recognise the problem, and in a sense, I suppose that one might be tempted to say, certainly to de-Judaify this problem. It's not only Israel. Actually, America, the United States of America, is rather good at that characterization of being a people that acquires might and believes it has a manifest destiny.
Well, it's plenty. They're universalist and particularly strange in Zionism. There are plenty of Zionists who believe that this is just our little piece of the world, and that we don't have a wider mission. But you also get, actually increasingly these days, a sense that Israel's at the vanguard of the saving of Western civilization. That's a very new development, really, in the last few decades, and you see that much in neoconservatism. I think that the question about whether Zionism is an appropriate response to the challenge of survival, I think there's one very good Zionist argument that Israel does contribute to Jewish survival, and one not very good argument. The very good argument is that it is incontestably true that today, and at any other point in history, having a state of refuge that has a certain amount of power can save individual Jews and individual Jewish communities. There's simply just no doubt about that, and I think that's the strongest argument for Zionism. The problem is, and the paradox is that whilst Zionism can save individual Jews and individual Jewish communities, the concentration of the Jewish population within Israel is not a good idea in terms of Jewish survival. It's actually diaspora. If you want to survive as a people, you actually have to disperse yourself as far as possible. And the more that the Jewish people are concentrated in Israel, the more they are vulnerable to threats. And in a way, that is, the arguments about Ahmadinejad and the bomb, and the Iranian bomb, in a way are a tacit recognition that Zionism, whilst it can ensure the survival of individual Jews and individual Jewish communities, cannot ensure the survival of the Jewish people as a whole, because it can be wiped out, because it's a small part of the world. And so that's why I have a lot of sympathy for Zionism, but it's also why I think that the claims that Jews have made for it have often been at least overstated and sometimes simply wrong. So
you have some fascinating pieces in the chapter on Israel on diaspora-Israeli relations, and actually one of the stories that you tell, which I think is very interesting, is the way in which the existence of Israel and the existence of a state layered onto all these other identities actually has transformed Jewish identity, which has become an Israeli identity within Israel, and that the relations, that the attitudes between diaspora Jews and Israelis are often really quite difficult. There's some quite shocking language in some of the things you quote about the project of creating muscle Jew, of a new man. These are words which actually make one worry. And have a whole lot of resonances which are rather worrying.
You're referring there to the fact that particularly early pre-state Zionism saw that diaspora Jewry was literally mentally, physically enfeebled.
Yes, and actually...
I quote a cartoon there by...
The cartoon is then later, is post-establishment of the state.
That argument is made less and less these days, in fairness, but it was certainly a powerful motivation to early Zionists, in particular Max Nordau, who coined the term the muscle Jew, muscle union. But the relationship between diaspora and Israel is much more complicated than that would suggest, because it became very clear, certainly within the second and third decades of the State of Israel life, that all Jews were not going to move to Israel. Certainly.
So a kind of love-hate relationship in that the diaspora was made safer, felt extremely proud, but did not want to move.
I know, particularly in places like Britain, there's been a steady and not insignificant trickle of Jews immigrating to Israel, but not the whole community, and that's never even looked likely. It has, incontestably. I mean, one of the strongest arguments against anti-Zionism is that if there was no state of Israel, the effect on Jewish self-confidence around the world would be absolutely horrific and catastrophic. It has made Jews feel safer and prouder, and that's very, very important, particularly in the post-Holocaust period.
How do Israelis live this vicarious enjoyment of a nation by people who aren't contributing except possibly financially?
It depends on the Israelis. I mean, Israel is such a fragmented country. There is the sort of hardcore secular leftist Israelis often see the diaspora with total bewilderment.
Why are you not here doing this wonderful building this wonderful project? And why are you building what you are building here?
Yeah, some Zionists see that the existence of the diaspora is totally bewildering and totally frustrating. But I think those numbers are starting to fall in the sense that both people on the right of Zionism, but also left-wing Zionists and just simply left-wing anti-Zionist Israelis, are seeing that the diaspora actually is incredibly helpful to Israel, both in supporting and in criticising Israel's policies. It's actually very useful to have a diaspora in purely instrumental terms, but also there's a sense, really in the 90s, Zionists, the more forward-thinking Zionist intellectuals in Israel, inside organisations like the Jewish Agency, began to talk about partnership between Israel and diaspora. Which was partly a recognition that Israel had the secular Israeli culture that had developed had been denuded in a lot of its Jewish context, and actually that Israelis can actually learn from the diaspora to a certain extent. One area where you can see that is that in Israel, where Israel has benefited from the diaspora is in the fact that Reform Judaism barely had a presence in Israel until relatively recent decades, and it's actually been places like America and Britain, where Reform Judaism is very strong, that have tried to actively work to develop Reform Judaism in Israel and increase its profile and increase its ability to respond to threats from the Orthodox.
You touch on, of course, the sort of historical accident in a way which has given Orthodox Judaism such a large institutional role,
in particularly ultra-Orthodox
in Israeli society. There's something actually to complete very very small point, but there was one point in the book. The book is peppered with little asides. So this is as if you were a tour guide and you're explaining complicated, momentous things, and all of a sudden you say, and actually, by the way, the favourite food here is this, or there's a joke about this. These are, on the whole, extremely enjoyable. There was one which slightly made me sit up, and maybe the printed version isn't quite this. On the electronic version, there was a difficult passage precisely about this, about ultra-Orthodox Jews in modern Israel, their role, the difficulty, the fraught nature of the politics, and the paragraph ended and opened up onto something about falafel and its role as a national dish. The contrast was striking.
Well, that's Israel for you. I mean, whether you love Israel or hate it, the one thing I would demand from everybody around the world is that you recognise that Israel is not monolithic, that it is impossibly complicated, even if you're just looking at Jewish Israel, and then when you add in the other minorities, the sort of Palestinian residents of Israel plus the West Bank.
The other minorities, the Jews aren't minorities in Israel.
No. The minorities such as, but there are minorities within the Jewish population.
Of course.
It almost becomes too impossible to really handle, which means that despite everything, despite the fact that I'm often very often very critical about what Israel does, and there are indeed problems with Zionism, why I'm very attracted to Israel, because at the very least what it's shown is this incredible efflorescence of new and diverse ways of being Jewish that aren't just reducible to being a national identity. And that's what makes Israel so interesting, what makes Judaism so interesting.
This seems like a very good point. We talked about fear, we talked about the state and Israel. It seems a very good point to backtrack and go over the advent of modernity, as it were, emancipation, and what emancipation did and is still doing to Judaism. Actually, I have a footnote question, which is, you oscillate a little bit between talking about Judaism and talking about Jewishness. The word seemed... is this an irrelevance to it?
No, to be honest, it's a bit of a nightmare. I mean, I didn't like the fact. I start the book by saying I don't particularly like the fact that the book is about Judaism, because it's about more than just what you might understand as Judaism. Jewishness works in some contexts, Judaism works in other contexts, Jews works in others.
Why this? I mean, is there? One's always a little bit. One always wonders about what the language coding is
Because
doing.
these are
here.
not these terms are these English terms are actually foreign to Judaism. Jews don't, if you look at the Hebrew terms, the idea, the term for religion is a modern Hebrew word. The term for Judaism, people 2,000 years ago didn't necessarily use the kind of terms and concepts we do,
Of course,
at the moment.
and the King James Bible is full of Israelites, so a term
Which is also hugely problematic.
Problematic, exactly.
It's the sense that one of the reasons why, in particular, the term Judaism is wrong is that the term Judaism as like Christianity or Islam does imply a creed. And Judaism doesn't have a creed. It doesn't have a fixed set of principles that you can easily point to. It has a constantly shifting set of controversies over a set of canonical texts.
So is Judaism an ism? Is there a difference between an ism and a nes? I mean, a nes seems to attach to identity better. I mean, there's not Englishism. There may be Anglicism, I'm not sure.
There are certainly Judaisms. There are certainly different visions of what Judaism should be. But above all of that, there is Jewishness, which is about the identity, the state of being Jewish, what it means to be Jewish, what it feels to be Jewish.
So let's go back to this question of emancipation, which, as you say in the book, has had such an impact on what that is. As you take it, emancipation, essentially in 18th century, beginning more or less 18th century Enlightenment thinking, leads to various forms of crisis. And you have the crisis of assimilation, which is abandoning identity. You have the crisis of a private Judaism, which in a sense starts to hide but invite a conception of difference. I mean, you start having conspiracy theory that comes out of that view of, well, in private it's all different.
Right.
You have the refusal of modernity, the refusal of assimilation in the traditionalist communities. You have a fundamentalism which starts to grow out of which is only possible under conditions of modernity. You then tell the story of the relationship between Jewishness and radicalism, which again comes out of, well, we've emancipated, what about the rest of the world? And then kind of going towards often universalist left-wing positions of views of radicalism, which then get tied up in anti-colonial, anti-Zionist positions. So this whole story of modernity seems extremely fraught.
It's a huge mess, but it's a hugely creative mess, because what it did is it forced the creation of new kinds of Judaism and new ways of being Jewish that were hugely innovative, and that again ensured the survival. I mean, my sense is that actually the diversity, whilst messy and very fraught and very conflictual and uncomfortable, is one of the reasons why Judaism survived emancipation. It was because we as a people pretty much tried every different route to being Jewish, and eventually, by the late 20th century, coming to some kind of accommodation that seems to work. But again, it's not even assured now. I mean,
but to talk a little bit about the link between that modernization and the catastrophe of that modernization, because after all, the anti-Semitism is unthinkable without those reactions to modernity, and particularly the modern anti-Semitism that leads to the Holocaust is unthinkable without that particular universalizing conception of what Enlightenment man ought to be.
Well, it was a terrible trap. Emancipation was a terrible trap, because it basically said, you can be free, but you have to at the very least play down your Jewishness. You have to restrict it. And of course, when Jews did take that as it were and either assimilated it or played down their Jewishness, they found that either they were still the target of renewed forms of anti-Semitism,
and rather dangerous ones, in that all of a sudden the conspiracy was born.
Much more dangerous forms,
because they were assimilated,
and also anti-Semitisms that are tied to nationalism and to scientific quote unquote racism. So or these forms of these sort of more slightly apologetic forms of Judaism found that they they couldn't stop assimilation either. That's always been the big criticism of Reform Judaism, is that it slowed assimilation but didn't completely stop.
And that assimilation didn't undermine anti-Semitism, which of course was a great boost to Zionism and early Zionist argument.
But I do think, though, you've got in the 20th century, certainly in the post-war period, I think really for the first time, the kind of total assimilation that some Jews wanted in the 19th century but never quite achieved is now possible.
But you wouldn't say that it was possible in pre-Holocaust Austro-Hungarian Empire Germany, and that actually, in a sense, it was precisely that complete assimilation which led to its
It was possible for some. Some Jews managed it. Particularly in places like Britain or America, where it was a lot.
Or Austria, or Vienna, for that matter.
Well, but then it got turned up again by Hitler, which didn't happen, of course, in Britain and America. But I think today it is possible to have somebody who is so generationally who is so removed from Judaism that kind of total assimilation is possible. Having said that, there's always this constant process of rediscovering. Jews often rediscover their Judaism and find new ways of being Jewish based on it. In fact,
and to go back, this is exactly one of the points that Finkelkraut is so nostalgic about, which is all the ways of being Jewish that it was possible to have. You actually are slightly less expansive. I felt you also have a sort of list of the breadth, all the ways of being Jewish. You nevertheless tend to you do think that a certain amount of ritual observance tends to characterize a minimum level. I mean, the complete non ritual following, some sort of Jew by identification that doesn't follow.
Well, that's the hilarious thing about Israeli secularism, is that self-defined militantly secularist Jews in Israel will often do a Passover meal. They may often
So the equivalent of so-called Christians doing Christmas.
It's a little more than that, actually. It's a little more than that, because a lot of these festivals are more of an imposition than a pleasure, like Christmas is. Even in the militantly secular kibbutzes, there was still a sense of celebrating the traditional agricultural Jewish festivals. So, and I think that whilst personally I'm very sympathetic to secular Judaism, I reluctantly have to conclude that some element of religious practice does help bolster Jewish transmission, Jewish continuity, senses of Jewishness.
Right. So where that transmission, that community is about identity, is about how an identity gets transmitted through time.
What keeps Jewishness alive and what keeps it being transmitted is that it's quite thick. There's a lot of stuff that you do, right? It's not just about saying I am Jewish. It's a lot more than that. If you're Jewish, you can do a lot of stuff. And even the Jews who do least often do something, even maybe not a lot. And it's that huge a number of rituals and practices and customs that keep it alive, whereas other cultures and ethnicities often have it more difficult because, particularly when they're removed. I mean, I remember reading, for example, a piece of research about the fate of Maltese people in Britain. A lot of Maltese people came in Britain during and after the war. And within a few decades, as a self-conscious community, it was much reduced because the second and third generation didn't really take it on, and that's because there wasn't as much to Malteseness as there was to Judaism. Not that I'm saying that in any way that Judaism is better than Malteseness or anything like that.
Okay. So
it's just there's so much stuff to it that it provides a lot of poles around which to cohere, and it makes survival a little bit easier than it does for other ethnic and cultural groups.
So one of the things that's terribly difficult in this space, and it's you make a note of this, is that one often finds that anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism sort of meet in a certain kind of Jewish exceptionalism, and in fact you address you're not scared to address this head on. You touch on this question. So in your last chapter, you in a sense admit a certain Jewish exceptionalism and saying, well, look, yes, Jews have done terribly well in lots of modern capitalist contexts. By the way, on the emancipation point, this is a note, but Kant, the great Enlightenment thinker, does not know what to. He has to invent a new discipline. He invents an anthropology. He calls it anthropology in order to say, what do we do with the Jews who refuse in our society who refuse enlightenment, who refuse this thing. So in a sense, he says, well, let's be scientific about them and study what leads to that refusal. Sorry, that was a. But all I'm saying is that you, in a sense, then take that and say, well, there is something about the way in which Jewish identity has slotted into modernity, to capitalism, and has led to yet another state of exception.
I mean, I don't want to talk about that there's a particular Jewish genius or that there's a particular Jewish talent, because I think that's exactly where philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism meet.
Exactly.
And I'm very uncomfortable with it. But there is no doubt that Jews punch way, way above their weight. We are hugely prominent in most of the countries where we
yes,
are.
So how do you, my question is, how do you marry those two positions?
Because you can look, the reasons why there are a lot of Jews in the arts, the entertainment, in politics, in business, there are reasons for it that aren't that bizarre.
So role models.
It's partly role models. It's partly it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Other Jews see that happening. It's partly because if you look at the way Jews emancipated, we didn't have land.
Back to the portability question.
We were portable. Jews have created over the centuries highly educated culture, and that emphasised finding whatever niches you could. It's certainly in the pre-modern world as traders or as moneylenders or whatever, or niches that you were allowed. And within capitalism, that meant they were hugely well placed to deal with that because they had a proto-capitalist culture, and they had an educated and literate culture.
But you have a sort of what you have, and it seems to me that this is an important point about identity. And identity in general in the modern world is what you have is you have capitalism without individualism, right? There's a conception of a we, and that goes to the heart of an identity.
Yes and no. I mean, it's a hot topic about whether when Jews achieve in art, science, business, whatever, they're doing it as Jews, or whether they're doing it, some of them times they're doing it actively to leave Judaism behind. Did the Rothschilds, were they bankers in a particularly Jewish way? That's a very, very difficult and sensitive thing to say, and gives me the heebie-jeebies even to raise it. Certainly some...
But you raise these questions in your last chapter. You can't avoid them.
You can't avoid them. Certainly you can see that some figures, you can see that you can trace their work, what they achieve, very directly to the Jewishness. If you look at Sacha Baron Cohen, you can see that he's drawing off on Jew and playing with Jewish sense of otherness in not always in unproblematic ways.
No, when it comes to Kazakh anti-Muslim positions, I find it terribly difficult.
But he's drawing on that Jewish background. Other people are doing it. I mean, you look at one of the things I'm interested in Jews and heavy metal.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to trace. Or Jews and rock music. How did the Judaism get into Mark Bolan, who is Jewish? What's Mark Bolan's Jewishness have to do with his work? Now, some people have argued, of course, that in the case of rock and roll, for example, that it's the Jewish sense of being cultural intermediaries between black and white culture that allowed them, particularly as writers and producers and impresarios, to make such a contribution.
Which is a version of the emancipation story, of course, which is that emancipation is something which is not only which the Jews, in a sense, under modernity were the first in line for, but there are many in line for emancipation.
Sure. I mean, it's so you look at, and often a lot of this stuff is very, very difficult to interpret. I mean, you look at Al Jolson and his use of blackface. On the one hand, it was drawing on a Jewish attempt to use blackness to attain white privilege. On the other hand, it was also a Jewish identification with blackness and otherness. And this is the difficulty of contemporary Judaism.
But it seems to me that if, and as a sociologist, you're interested in the way in which identity primes behaviour. And in this book, you're taking us on a guide through identity. You're in a way you are talking about how this particular identity is leading to these particular social outcomes.
Yes, but identity is always in process. I mean, the question of what Jews, it's not that you have identity A leading to effect B. What you're having is the constant experience of the Jews have of tackling Jewishness leads to these constantly changing results.
So is that, in a sense, if one wanted to be universalist at this point, would one go on to say, well, actually, the story here is about what it is to have an identity, and both in its problematic and in its joyful characteristics, and that actually the story of universalism should be a story of universalizing identities rather than these other attempts at universalization which Christianity has taken, which the left has often taken, which are universalizations around individuality.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, and that would be a very Jewish position in the sense that, you know, as I go back to say, the idea of the chosen people is you're not better than anybody else. You're just chosen for a particular task. So it's a world of where there are lots of different peoples with different roles to play. I mean, I suppose if you wanted Jewish utopia, that would be it. Is that there's something very Jewish about the idea of difference. Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, hardly a radical in many respects, talks about the dignity of difference as being the Jewish difference with Greek Platonic philosophy, is that university comes in our differences, and I like that very much. Although if you look closer at some of what Sachs is saying, it's much more conservative than it may first appear. And I think the other thing that I end the book on is the sense that it's not just about identity, a universalistic celebration of identity. It's also about that Judaism teaches us that identity is never fixed, it never ends, and that's very, very explicit in Jewish tradition. You're never supposed to stop learning, you're never supposed to stop reflecting, you never reach an end point, you are never saved. You are always working, and that, if you look at the thing that ties together both secular Jews and religious Jews, is often that constant itch that that drives you onward. And that is something that's very Jewish.
So Keith, we've gone on for about an hour. I have to say, I recommend to everyone the book Judaism, All That Matters. Actually, I have just a quick question about that subtitle, All That Matters. It's not the claim that this book contains all that matters about Judaism, but is the claim that Judaism is all that matters?
No, it's not. It's neither of those things. It's actually, I would say that's about marketing, because it's part of a new series of short introductions called All That Matters, and this is the Judaism one.
I see. This is the quick notes, as it were.
I think so.
And
I think those Hodder who published this book would not claim that actually literally every book in their series is everything that matters.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that it isn't all that matters, because both within Judaism and outside, it seems to me that there is much more.
It's not that all that matters to me, although it matters to me a great deal. It's not all that matters to me.
Well, I'm glad that it's all that matters to Hodder's shareholders. Your next book, or at least one of the book projects on your website, very intriguing, is Big Fish in Small Ponds. Can you just spend 2 minutes telling us about that, and possibly its relation to identity, which seems to me to be quite interesting?
Well, I'm actually working on two books. One is this book called The Best Water Skier in Luxembourg, Tales of Big Fish in Small Ponds. That's about me going to different communities, different small worlds that I know nothing about, and tracking down the big fish in them. So I started off with The Best Water Skier in Luxembourg. I recently returned from Alderney in the Channel Islands, where I tried to find the top politician. I'm going to places like Malta, Iceland, other places like that. The book's being crowdfunded through the Unbound website. That's a quick plug. But yes, it's not an academic book, but it has a serious purpose, despite the funny title, in the sense that it's a celebration really of community. It's a celebration
particularity, in a way.
Of particularity, and of the fact that things like Judaism, Jewish communities, may be very well known, but there are plenty of other communities where people find meaning, and this is where the world happens. It's not in the big communities or the big worlds. It's often within the big obscure worlds.
So it is a practical example of what we ended up on, which is universalism through many particularisms.
Indeed, it is, and it's also saying that people can find the big fish in small ponds. It can be just as fulfilling to be a big fish in a small pond as it is to be the president of America or whatever. The other book I'm writing is about the divisions in the Jewish community over Israel and what to do about them, which is something as a British Jew concerns me very much. Israel is a hugely divisive issue, both in Britain and America and other diaspora communities. The way we deal with it, we often don't deal with it, or deal with it in very uncivil ways. And I'm writing a book that analyses the situation and proposes some, not solutions, but ways of managing the problem.
Keith, we could go on for a very long time. I have to get to work. You probably have to get to work. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating and scratch on the surface of these many complex topics.
Thanks a lot, Tony.